Alkinani. He's an independent researcher on identity politics in Iraq and the Middle East. He joins us here in Doha. Zeidon, let's talk first about the latest developments. The US says it's now deployed 750 soldiers to the region. How volatile is this embassy situation now, and what exactly is Iran's involvement?
Iran's involvement is that it's trying to pull the attention away from the protest movement that began in early October. This is one of the very few tactics that Iran is using to denounce and minimize the influence of the protest movement since early October, which heavily created a very strong and prominent anti-Iran sentiment across the country. In fact, it was the loudest and heaviest anti-Iran sentiment in post-2003 Iraq. If we look at the gradual consequence of the events, it's clearly just one of the very few events of the long dispute between Iran and the US. Iraq, as many countries in the region, has been a battlefield between Iranian and the US interest. But at the same time, Iran and the US also share a common interest, and that is not to have the protest movement succeed in Iraq, because the Iraqi government has a dual partnership between the US and Iran. The Iraqi government is an ally, it's an ally to the US, despite being a failed democracy, because it was the US invasion that created that failed democracy. And as we have been witnessing for the past few weeks, Iran is the greatest ally to the Iraqi government. Therefore, this is just a way to pull the attention away from the protest movement and try to let the people in Iraq feel that those soldiers. Yeah.
Zeidon, let me just jump in here, because President Trump said that Iran will pay a heavy price for the initial attack that killed a US contractor. But then he later seemed to soften his rhetoric, saying he doesn't want war with Iran. So how is the diplomacy likely to play out then, do you think?
Well, Iran and the US have been using that rhetoric of threatening each other, but at the same time softening it when they realize that the direct confrontation will cost both of them a very heavy price. Iran wouldn't risk its own influence in Iraq by confronting the US in such a direct, complete warfare type of war. It knows that if it loses its interest against the US in Iraq, it will lose all of its arms across the region, whether it be in Lebanon, Syria or Yemen. They might be threatening each other, they might be showing off their military muscles for a few weeks, but by the end of the day, they just want to prove to both sides that one is more influential than the other. The US knows what it controls in Iraq, and Iran knows what it controls in Iraq.
Zeidon, stay with us for a minute, because I want to play some pictures for our viewers, because video on social media appears to show a senior Iraqi military officer pleading with supporters of Iran-backed militia groups to move away from the US embassy compound. Lieutenant General Abdul Amir Rashid Yarala is deputy head of Iraqi joint operations, and the video seems to show him surrounded by people believed to be paramilitary fighters who chant, "The people want to topple the occupation," as he speaks. Let's just listen in to what he had to say.
Your blood is precious. This is not worth it, my dear. If we shoot one of you, it is wrong. We don't want one of ours to die. Let us sit outside and talk. Let's wrap this up. Whatever you want, just not here. There, better. This way, it would be over.
So, Zeidon, what is all of this telling us about how Iraqi forces are dealing with the security situation there?
Well, the Iraqi forces, or the Iraqi governmental forces, have been put in a very confusing and sensitive position. As I mentioned, they share a partnership and an alliance with both countries, the US and Iran. But because the Iraqi government, in one way or another, is involved and opened the door for the PMF forces to enter the green zone, that green zone has blocked its entrance for the past 3 months against protesters who have been trying to enter the green zone. Yet it took a few hours for those protesters or those PMF members to enter it very easily. So the Iraqi government now has to prove to the US that it's taking either a neutral stance or it's protecting the US embassy, because that's what a government has to do to a diplomatic entity or a building, especially when it comes to the US, which is the most prominent, which is the most powerful embassy in Baghdad.
Zeidon Alkinani, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with Al Jazeera. All right, lots more still to come on the news.